Hello, I'm Olivia Mattis, welcoming you today on behalf of the Sousa Mendez Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm coming to you from a different location than my usual one. I'm visiting my parents, so I have a different background, but it's still me and still the Sousa Mendez Foundation. So, um, thank you all for being here. We are showing a program about the refuseniks, the Soviet Jews who were refused permission to leave Russia in those days. And we have an amazing panel who will be introduced by our moderator. Our moderator is Jana Kaplan from Brandeis University, who was herself a refusenik. Also, we have a sponsor. We have two sponsors actually today. We have one specifically for the program and one for our whole series. So today's sponsor is the Soviet Jewry Movement Archives Project, where you can learn more about the history of the Soviet Jewish refusenik movement. And then our series sponsor is the Tamara Vandenberg Ferguson Family Foundation, and we're very grateful to all of them. So without further ado, I will hand the floor to Jana Kaplan. Jana, go ahead and take the floor.
Olivia, thank you so much. I'm truly honored to work with Sousa Mendez Foundation and to moderate this distinguished panel, whom I will introduce in a minute. But first, let me just give you some context, some very general sketch of the times leading to the events portrayed in the film that we are discussing today. The film about the refusenik movement and the events called Operation Wedding, when a group of refuseniks decided to hijack a small aircraft to leave the Soviet Union because they saw no hope. They were chronically refused indefinitely. So the history that led to that starts probably in the 1950s, mid-50s, after Stalin's death. Prior to 1960s in general, the Soviet government primarily faced dissidents, Soviet citizens, many of them Jews and most of them intellectuals, who took advantage of the political thaw following Stalin's purges and denunciation of his cult of personality. Dissidents addressed issues of nuclear arms race, massive environmental pollution, censorship in the news, arts and literature and media, anti-Semitism, and other human rights violations. Anti-Semitism, being state-sponsored, permeated the entire fabric of Soviet society. Yet at that time, dissidents' goal was to bring change from within. By identifying the issues and using the legal and civil processes to that end. By mid-1960s, Soviet Jews became convinced that it wasn't working. Many Jews started attempting to emigrate to Israel, but were denied exit visas, labeled отказники, refuseniks, and persecuted. Some early refuseniks were also dissidents, but the majority were Soviet Jews from all walks of life who wanted to live as Jews and have freedoms and opportunities inherent in human rights. Consequently, refuseniks were treated as enemies, deprived of jobs, sources of livelihood, and basic human rights. Some severe persecutions affected adults and children alike. Refuseniks created a vibrant underground Jewish culture in the Soviet Union in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, which included an elaborate network of Jewish education, Jewish religious education and practices, seminars in arts, sciences, literature, music, intellectual and community life. Among those ulpanim, which is Hebrew for study groups, Refuseniks formed underground Zionist groups, some considering extreme measures to reach freedom. All this was happening behind the Iron Curtain, with minimal information smuggled out of the Soviet Union about the reality of the refuseniks and dissidents' lives. And so we get to June of 1970, Operation Wedding. I'm now going to introduce our panel. It is a great honor for me to introduce ANAT ZALMANSON KUZNETSOV. ANAT's illustrious legacy, or yichus, which is Yiddish for legacy through matrimony, is phenomenal. She's the daughter of Silva Zalmanson and Eduard Kuznetsov, two of the leaders and organizers of the Soviet Jewry event we will be discussing today. Yichus aside, Anat achieved prominence in her own right, as the Operation Wedding will undoubtedly prove. Anat Zalmanson Kuznetsov was born and raised in Israel and studied filmmaking in Israel and England before embarking on a film career where she had success in both popular media and promotional productions. Anat's most recent documentary, Operation Wedding, was released in 2016 in Israel and has since appeared in film festivals around the world, and has also won awards for Best Documentary and Best Story. Anat feels the need to make sure that the next generation is familiar with the struggle of Soviet Jews. She produced a film of archival materials for historians on the struggle of Soviet Jews. She also began pushing out materials about Soviet Jewry through social media and developed an educational online program with Luchstein Center of Bar-Ilan University in Israel. Our next panelist is Glenn Richter, a political science graduate of Queens College in New York. He helped found the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry in 1964 under the leadership of Yakov Birnbaum, whose grandfather coined the term Zionism. Drawing on civil rights movement tactics, Student Struggle led innovative demonstrations, lobbied Congress, and coordinated with global activists to support Jews oppressed in the USSR. Following the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry shifted to support Soviet Jewish immigration to Israel and rebuilding Jewish life in Russia for those who chose to stay. Glenn now devotes himself to Jewish volunteer work, including monitoring court cases involving anti-Semitic violence. We now are going to start the actual discussion, the actual event, and I would like to start with Anat and ask her a couple of questions, which really will bring us to the substance of the film Operation Wedding. Anat, what brought your parents, Silva Zalmanson and Eduard Kuznetsov, to becoming dissidents and refuseniks? And what led them to Operation Wedding as a culmination of their journey?
Well, actually, my parents have very different stories, completely different stories. Up until the point that they met, their life were completely different. So my mother was brought up in a traditional Jewish family. They celebrated all the holidays. They learned Hebrew. They listened to Kol Israel, the voice of Israel, on the radio. They were dreaming about Israel. They were talking about being in Israel their whole lives. And my father, on the other hand, he grew up in Moscow to an assimilated family, but he himself felt connected to Judaism. It didn't come from home. He would declare, "I'm Jewish," and then he would go into fight with people because of anti-Semitism. And he was so when he was 20, he actually published an anti-Soviet newspaper underground. Obviously, it's not allowed. This was enough for him to receive 7 years in prison. It was actually Vladimir prison. For those who heard about it, it's the worst labor camp in the Soviet Union. So after he was released, he heard that in Latvia, in Riga, he heard that some people were received exit visas because in 1969, 1,000 people received exit visas out of 3 million. Yeah. So he went to Riga, he met my mother, they got married, and they hijacked the plane. Well, my mom, she asked twice. She asked for permission to leave the country and she was refused. My dad also asked and he was refused. And my mom, she was even told that she's even not allowed to ask for permission again. So she wasn't even allowed to ask it again. So it was impossible. She always said going to Israel felt like going to the moon.
Wow. So should we see that clip now?
Yeah, we can watch something that my parents, when I interviewed them, it's not shown in the film. So it's like some of the interviews that I had, and they're talking about what it's like to be a Jew in the USSR. I actually would like to note something that I didn't think about it when I was making the film. But after I started showing it, like a year after, I realized, oh my God, I should have put it in the film. Because my parents actually, both of them in Riga, they lived in the center of Riga, like they had a nice apartment. My mom actually did have a job as an engineer. So, because a lot of people think that, they were living uncomfortable life, like some sort of ghetto, but no, they were actually living really comfortable life. The only thing that was not comfortable was anti-Semitism and the fact that they didn't feel like they belong. So I'm sorry that I didn't put it in the film, but at least you guys can see a little bit about it.
Russia every time was a rather xenophobic country and anti-Semitic. So your neighbors very early say you that you are Jewish. They thought you are dirty Jew, you have to be killed. It's a pity that Hitler didn't finish with all your nation and so on.
חצר, שאני שיחקתי עם ילדים, אז הרבה פעמים אני שמעתי משהו, קריאות גנאי, אנטישמיות. אז אני הייתי לבד בין כל הילדים, והם הרביצו לי כי הייתי יהודייה היחידה, אני חושבת, והמורים לא היו מתערבים בזה. וזה אני זוכרת, ומה שלא יגידו לי עכשיו, אני יודעת שהם לא חברים שלנו.
What is anti-Soviet? What is considered back then to be crime, to do crime?
Okay, yeah. We read some underground literature. We made this, self-made this literature, magazines, spread them, critically spoke about the present situation and so on. So it's enough to be sentenced to 7 years imprisonment.
Can you give me examples of what was considered a crime or betrayal?
Well, listening to foreign broadcasts was viewed as a potential crime. People would not be put in jail, but they would be suspected of potential conspiracy against the Soviet system, and they would be watched by the security. And if they made them step further, they would probably be arrested and charged with anti-Soviet activities. The Soviet system, in that sense, was very simple. you even if you have a dinner, and there are more than 3 people, well, the KGB will get a report about what they talked at the dinner table.
So, yeah, that was the reality of the Soviet life. Anat, before we switch to the presentation of Glenn, I wanted to just quickly ask you, so it is considered that Operation Wedding and the Leningrad trials were the seminal event that put that first crack in the Soviet side of the Iron Curtain, which was hiding the Jewish persecution and suffocating Jewish situation in the USSR from the international awareness. Did Operation Wedding organizers envision what their role will be? How did they view the impact of their success or possibly their failure on the fate of the Soviet Jewry?
Well, obviously, first of all, they knew they were going to be caught or maybe even shot in the air. So they definitely did it because they felt it was the right time. They knew about the movement in the free world in the West, so they wanted to use that momentum. But I can guarantee you that they could not imagine the effect that it had, because in the 60s they were about 3,000 Jews received exit visas, but in the 70s there were 173,000, I think. So that's quite a lot more. Yeah.
Well, your answer leads me perfectly to our next panelist, Glenn Richter. We'll get back to you right after Glenn's presentation. Operation Wedding achieved the proverbial first crack in the Soviet side of the Iron Curtain. And Glenn, what was the role of American and international movements and organizations advocating on behalf of the Soviet Jewry, with Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry as a case in point, in recognizing that crack and working to expand it to the breaking point? I know we wanted to show a very brief video clip before you actually start talking.
From 1964 to 1970, the student struggle for Soviet Jewry was active every day. Countless demonstrations, rallies, marches, all sorts of things. But we didn't get the highest kind of visibility, the visibility we wanted. It wasn't until the time of the Leningrad trial that the dam burst.
All over Israel, cars have been asked to stop and pedestrians to stand at attention for 2 minutes to protest the trials in Leningrad.
Let the media see, let the whole world see. Liberté pour les Juifs du RSD, liberté. 1, 2, 3, 4, open up the iron door. 5, 6, 7, 8, let the people emigrate.
Okay, Glenn, you have the floor.
Thank you. That's quite an intro. On a clear Moscow morning in May 1988, a group of 7 of us from the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry, led by Rabbi Avi Weiss, walked into Red Square. Inside the Kremlin, President Ronald Reagan was meeting with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. On a signal, we pulled out from under our jackets cloth signs for the freedom of Soviet Jews, Talesim and Shofrot. While Western media, whom we had tipped off beforehand, filmed us, a crowd of curious Soviet citizens gathered around, and of course the ever-present KGB. A Western correspondent asked one of the Russians what he thought about this demonstration. "What about me?" he replied loudly. "I've been out of work for 5 years." Within 90 seconds, a gray KGB car pulled up. He was thrown inside and taken away. We were protected by the presence of the Western press. This poor Russian had no one to protect him, and we have no idea what happened to him. There's lots more that we did that day, but that's for another talk. Now let's circle back 24 years earlier and find out how we discovered the plight of Jews in the USSR and what we did for it in the next decade, although our work continued until the Kremlin's disintegration in 1991. It's hard to believe in today's world of instantaneous communication that we knew so little back in the early 1960s about the plight of 3 million of our brethren trapped behind the Iron Curtain. But the Kremlin had a pretty airtight lid on information. A couple of rabbinic delegations some years earlier saw largely what the authorities wanted them to see. So who had the information? Well, the Israeli government did via its secret liaison bureau, staffed with guys who had run illegal Jewish immigration into Palestine and then worked with Mossad. Israel was relatively weak at that time. The Kremlin was all-powerful. So the bureau tasked a scholar in New York and another in London to publish information. That's how I, as a political science major, got to read the expose called The Status of Jews in the Soviet Union in a 1963 issue of Foreign Affairs magazine. Meanwhile, other events grabbed the imagination of us young American Jews, especially the civil rights movement, which was in its idealistic phase. I became a volunteer in New York with SNCC, the Student Then Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Most young Jews in this era were not about to go out and actually demonstrate for civil rights in America, but the call for equal rights, civil and religious, for Jews in the USSR provided an outlet for this pent-up passion. A bit later, in 1966, Elie Wiesel's searing book, The Jews of Silence, gave us a kickstart. In it, he asked if the Jews of silence were those whom he met in the Soviet Union or those in the free world among whom he lived today. Jacob, Yakov Birnbaum, had been a child in Nazi Germany. His grandfather, Nathan, had coined the term Zionism. Yakov's parents were able to flee with their family to London. After the war, Yakov assisted young Jewish refugees. Hearing of 3 million Jews trapped in the USSR, he moved to the US where he felt Washington's pressure on the Kremlin could make a difference. He sublet a room near Yeshiva University and knocked on students' doors to tell them about their Soviet brethren. Yakov initiated a meeting of students from different campuses at Columbia University on April 27, 1964. We there resolved that in 5 days, May Day, we would demonstrate at the Soviet UN mission. We marched for hours in silence to emphasize that Russian Jews were themselves silenced. Although we got page 2 coverage in the next day's New York Times, that was the last time we made the mistake of being silent. The next 6 months were a blur of activities: a fast-in at the Soviet mission, demonstrating at the Democratic Convention in Atlantic City, where Robert Kennedy spoke to us, a large rally in the heart of the Lower East Side, picketing a Soviet troop at Lincoln Center. The ripple effect worked outwards from New York City as more and more students from different campuses began to demonstrate and write letters to Congress and the president. We chartered a bus to Washington to lobby the State Department, presaging our annual university and high school Soviet Jewry lobby trips to Congress. Shlomo Carlebach penned the song Am Yisrael Chai in 1965 as SSSJ's marching song. Today, it's almost a second Hatikva. And of course, like any good 1960s protest organization, we produced lapel buttons and bumper stickers. So here's one. Are we, can you see it? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, are we the Jews of silence? Now, the other one has a little more interesting background. We saw the ubiquitous war is not healthy for Jews, for children and other living things in the anti-war movement. So we did a ripoff and we did a button. Russia is not healthy for Jews and other living things. Now, we got the anti-war movement pretty steamed up, but we survived. Okay. Our students said, why not a rally at the Statue of Liberty? So we rented a boat and we did just that. And then the 1967 Six-Day War. Little Israel defeated her Soviet-equipped foes. Some Russian Jews greeted each other with a hand over an eye, a la Moshe Dayan's eye patch. Jews in the USSR began to dream of connections with the heritage and with Israel. 2 years later, the Iron Curtain cracked a bit. Individual, then collectively, brave Jews began to publicly demand their right to emigrate to Israel. Just before his arrest and sentence to the Gulag, Boris Kachabayevsky of Kiev wrote an open letter. As long as I live, as long as I am capable of feeling, I will do all I can to be able to leave for Israel. And if I am sentenced and live to my release, I will be prepared to go to the homeland of my ancestors, even by foot. This photo obviously is not of Boris beforehand, but Boris either in the Gulag or after. In Soviet Georgia, 18 Jewish families wrote in lyrical, biblical terms of their yearning to be in Israel. Golda Meir broke Israel's public quietude and read their dramatic appeal to the Knesset. In the Baltics, swallowed up by the Soviet Union only in 1940, young Jews, especially in Riga, began self-education and clandestinely reaching out to Jews elsewhere in Russia, such as Leningrad. They even produced an underground Jewish journal, and that's where Anat's parents enter the picture. In a project initiated by Scandinavian Jews, then picked up by the shadowy Liaison Bureau, knowledgeable Jews with non-Israel passports began to travel into the USSR to meet and teach their brethren. As more Jews spoke out and more were persecuted by the KGB, we had actually names and stories to personalize our message. American travelers brought back tales of encounters with our brethren. We no longer asked for civil rights for Soviet Jews. We, like them, demanded their freedom to emigrate. On June 15, 1970, Anat's parents, along with others, were arrested at an airport in Leningrad and elsewhere for planning to take over a 12-seat biplane flying on a route near the Soviet border and make a dash for freedom. They didn't know that the KGB actually had established that route to entrap them. When their trial took place in Leningrad in December, the international Jewish community united in mighty public protest. Several governments joined the condemnation. The Kremlin actually backed down to some extent, substituting death penalties with years in the Gulag. A year later, in a perfect example of the grassroots energy of the Soviet Jewry movement, which two friends of mine initiated an intense effort which culminated in a full house Madison Square Garden rally. Ruthie Alexandrovich, one of the Leningrad trial defendants who had been let out early, spoke to an ecstatic crowd. In the 60s decades, only 3,000 to 4,000 Jews were allowed to emigrate from the USSR. But through the efforts of all of us in the Soviet Jewry movement, from 1970 to the fall of the USSR in 1991, about 690,000 Jews helped tear the Iron Curtain into shreds, as many hundreds of thousands did later. On our American side, we helped form a new generation of young Jews. Unlike most of our parents during the Shoah, we were not afraid to speak truth to either Soviet or US power on behalf of our brethren in danger. We helped create new modalities of public pressure, and we were not silent.
Thank you so much. This is amazing. And I, on a personal note, as a refusnik in Leningrad, I met many of the student struggle for Soviet Jewry travelers, and their help was extraordinary to keep the morale, to really re-energize us to keep going, fighting for our freedom. We are moving on with our program, and Anat, I'm getting back to you, and I have a few more questions. The Soviets, Anat, the Soviets claimed that Operation Wedding was a terrorist act. How would you disprove this terrorism designation?
Well, that's pretty easy. A terrorist definition is someone that's threatening civilians for political reasons. This group did not threaten any civilians because they bought all the tickets to the plane. The idea was of the pilot himself. They're not hijacking people, they're not hurting people, and the plane would have been returned also. So therefore, they only endangered themselves. That's the difference between a hero and a terrorist.
Absolutely. And the film actually describes how the Operation Wedding participants took diligent steps in preparing how to save otherwise empty airplanes, pilots, and even protect them from weather and cold.
Yeah, and also the two pilots that they were supposed to be removed before flying, obviously. So they bought them tents and bottles of vodka and tetanus shots. And when they were questioned in the trial, the pilots, they said that they wouldn't have been they wouldn't have tried to fight with them. So, but in any case, the group stated that there will be no blood shed for this operation, none whatsoever, except from themselves, maybe.
Yeah, that the film does make it very clear and quite remarkable, and also addresses the later KGB's statement how Jews were terrorists, and that event showed a different side of Jewish sacrificial even fight for their freedom. As a matter of fact, just a few months after the Operation Wedding, which happened in June of 1970, in November of 1970, a bomb exploded at the Aeroflot in office in Manhattan. That was a Soviet airline office, and the bomb killed an employee inside the building.
Well, that was Kahana.
That was Meir Kahana's,
yeah.
Yes, event, and even though, you know, some Jewish organization may have been involved, but Jews took a stand all over the world and claimed that that was terrorism, that was intended bloodshed, and Soviet Jewish immigration efforts would be harmed by that.
I agree. I also think that it didn't help, because it's quite the opposite actually of the stand that this group took. And yeah, I am you know, so I didn't like that part of the movement, but it was a very small part, and all the Jewish organizations were against it, as Glenn would also declare.
If you want to, I'll speak about it in a few moments when you ask me.
Anat, I also wanted to ask you, you took your mother to Russia. What kind of negotiations with the Russians did you have in order to ensure her safety and yours? And also, why did your father not take the trip? Was the risk greater for him?
Well, first of all, we went in 2015, so I didn't feel like there was a risk at all. We had a Russian producer, and they had approvals for everything, basically. So it's not like we just arrived and shot stuff. We had approvals in advance. Knowing what I know now, I know that, yeah, we weren't absolutely safe as I felt we were. I was a bit naive. My dad, he wasn't under a risk, but the thing is with my dad, in 1999, he traveled with the Israeli government delegation to Moscow for some political reasons, and then he was also interviewed for a daily TV show that is actually, we used it in my film as well, that you see him interviewed. So, and then, but when they wanted to return, suddenly in in the airport, they told him something is wrong with your passport. You cannot leave.
I see.
And so luckily, because he was with the prime minister, you know, they were able to figure something out. But then he said, I'm not stepping foot on this country again, and not any country near it. But there was no way of convincing him traveling with me. My mom didn't want to go also, but I kind of forced her. I was able to. My dad was a little bit more stubborn, I guess.
Yeah. Another question I want to ask you is about the timing. So your father says in the film how much time matters. He says even if the Operation Wedding event would happen even 1 year earlier, they would all have been summarily executed with no public knowledge. Timing mattered when they decided to take their step, to make their move. Anat, you released the film in 2016. Why did you decide to make the film when you did?
I decided to make the film in 2009, but I was unsuccessful to do so. So I was only, it took me so many years to reach that.
Деньги.
Yeah.
Well, yes, money.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Glenn, you wanted to add something to Anat's prior question.
Yeah, okay. I want to clarify the JDL situation. It's very important to understand. Look, the JDL was born out of frustration.
That's
We
Jewish
were, we,
Defense League by Mayor Kahana.
that's correct. We were nice guys. Okay, we were in the modality of the American early part of the civil rights movement. You know, people were terribly frustrated, and when you get frustrated, you go off the rails. But violence breeds its own destruction. So people who were involved in bombings or other things like that, and some of these people ended up in jail. I personally think that it scared the heck out of the Soviet Union. It scared the heck out of the United States government. I think in the short term, although we certainly were not part of it, it had its use. But I think in the long run, simply it was self-destructive. Now, the story about the person who got killed was actually in 1970, 72. It was 1972, and I tell you why, because I was involved in this part of the thing. It was 1972. It was the office of Sol Yurok. Sol Yurok was a Jewish impresario who brought in Soviet cultural troops.
Yeah, he
And a
brought
bomb
the
was placed
Soviet
in the office.
ballet. Yeah.
A bomb was placed in the office and killed a woman named Iris Cones. Little did I know that Iris Cones used a printer for Sol Yurok in the same building as we had our office in Manhattan. So a day or two later, I went down to the printer with a printing job. And the printer looks at me with fire in his eyes. And he said to me, "Did you do it?" And it suddenly occurred to me, I understood what he was saying. Did you do it? There's only one thing, because that was the big story. I said, no, we have nothing to do with this. We're peaceful. But he, as a person who was not Jewish, even though he was printing a large amount of our material, simply could not understand. He said Iris would come here and do the printing jobs. He simply could not understand. And we did not have the best relationship after that.
Thank you. We got to move on. We are now switching to Olivia. Olivia, you're going to do some announcements and a trailer. The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks so much, Jana. So there's this wonderful book that has come out, and it's about our hero, Aristides de Souza Mendes. It's called The World Entire, from the Talmudic saying, whoever saves a life saves the world entire. And it's a wonderful book for children. It's a picture book for ages, let's say 5 to 8 approximately. I'm going to show you some wonderful spreads. Okay, so here is Souza Mendes with Rabbi Kruger and other people, Souza Mendes's family and refugee children around the table. And it's just so wonderful. It has raised lettering, and it's a terrific book. I'm so pleased with it. So we have that available. That's one thing I wanted to let you all know. It's hot off the press. Number 2 is I wanted to tell you about our 2 upcoming programs. So we have a program coming up on September 28th. So that's in 2 weeks. And that's about the American newscaster Walter Winchell, who's a complicated figure, but we're focusing on his World War II period, where he did something very heroic, which was to use his immense platform. His program was in every American home, and he used the platform to defeat the American version of the Nazi Party. This was the German-American Bund that Walter Winchell almost single-handedly defeated with his radio broadcasts. So that is what we are focusing on in 2 weeks' time. And it's a fascinating story, fascinating film, and we'll see a trailer in a minute. In October, we have 2 programs. I'm going to tell you about the first of those, and that is on October 19th. We have a program called Music as Resistance, Reconstructing the Lost Music of Auschwitz. And this is profiling the amazing work of a British composer-conductor named Leo Geyer, a young man, and he's done heroic work. He spent 8 years going through the archives at Auschwitz, all of their little musical fragments that are in those archives, reconstructing what was the music, who were the prisoners who composed this music, and in what context. It's quite a piece of detective work, really amazing, and you won't want to miss it. But right now we're going to see a little trailer for the film about Walter Winchell.
Walter Winchell is the architect of modern American media. He turned journalism into a form of entertainment.
Marion Snowden's second husband, Louis Reed, announced that he would divorce the former Princess Rose Peleosi in Reno after Christmas.
Where in the past we might have wanted to gossip about our neighbors, now we can actually have gossip about people who are rich, glamorous, beautiful.
In the 1930s, Walter Winchell is one of the first to denounce the Nazis.
Hitler is too great a menace to ignore.
Many journalists, they didn't see the crucial aspect of this, and I think Winchell did.
Even if there were only one communist in the State Department, that would still be one communist too many.
In the 1950s, he helps lead a witch hunt.
McCarthy understood the enormous potential of having Winchell able to wield his power to destroy reputations and to destroy people that neither of them liked.
Winchell, in such an easy, quick way, could take anybody's career and destroy it.
The story of American decline is the story of an incompetent...
I wait for the facts, okay?
These worst-case scenario implications.
This is their plan, people. These are demons.
This notion that you can influence people through media, whether it's getting them to buy stuff, changing their politics, trading on their anger, Winchell's influence is still there. It sort of hovers over everything.
Good. So I do hope you'll sign up for these programs. You'll get an email after today's program with links to these two programs and a link for how to buy your signed and inscribed copy of this wonderful new book. So Jana, back to you for audience questions.
But the book would be a great present for the kids for Hanukkah. Just the pitch. We are now moving on with our panel, and it's time for questions and answers. For our audience, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box. We are not taking kind of live questions, but I would like to use my prerogative to start with my own questions. And I want to ask Anat a question about prisoner exchanges. Now, before I ask that question, let me give you some background, what I'm talking about. Operation Wedding led to a uniquely Soviet way of prisoner exchange. A couple of notes about this novelty factor. One, there was no designation of political prisoner in the Soviet Union. The prisoners were criminals, colloquially called hooligans, huligani. The second note is that the new thing here was that the Soviets started exchanging Soviet citizens, not arrested foreign spies for arrested in the West, West spies, Soviet citizens for prominent Western prisoners. Dissidents and refuseniks became a commodity in political and trade negotiations. Heads of state became involved, making deals involving Soviet prisoners of conscience and prisoners of Zion. Anat, can you speak more? And that was also a question, I prepared it as mine, but Jacqueline from Vienna in our audience asked, can you speak more on the role of Golda Meir in the liberation of your mother and saving your father's life, her contact with Franco, the Spanish dictator?
Well, that's two different stories completely. So basically, Golda had an idea. Well, not Golda, actually, Ija Rager, he was the head of Nativ. Nativ was like the Mossad but it was only designated for Soviet Jewry to save Soviet Jews. So he had an idea because he noticed that in Spain, exactly at the same time, there were, in Russia, at the same time, there were demonstrations against 6 death sentences that were made to Basque in Spain that actually killed 2 policemen. They were actually terrorists. They received death sentences. And the Soviet government, because you can only demonstrate if the Soviet government allows it, they demonstrated against the fascist who is killing those poor Basque while they're giving death sentences to 2 Jews who actually didn't plan to hurt anyone. Even on the trial, they were tried for high treason, not for terrorism or hijacking. We're using hijacking because it sounds better, but it's not really hijacking, right? So because there was this, obviously the communist needs to look more humanitarian than the fascist. So the idea was to approach Franco and to ask him, can you please commute the death sentences? And, by that you might help saving the lives of 2 Jews. And I think it was December 30th that he commuted the death sentences to 60 years. And the following day, December 31st, on the night just before the New Year's Eve, so they called my father and they called Mark Dimshitz, the pilot, and they told him, your death sentence was commuted to 15 years. So here you go. The communist is more humanitarian than the fascist. This is what happened. Of course, there was a lot of demonstrations that affected that too, but we think it looks like it's connected. And then my mother was released in 1974. That's 4 years. She received 10 years, but she was released 4 years after because there was a spy that was caught in Israel, a Soviet spy, and the release was a secret. Everything the Israeli government does is a secret because otherwise it would be judged, right? So so she was released. She didn't know she was released for that reason. And actually, so it was like a Friday night, and she was taken from Siberia to Leningrad, and she was told she's released. And she didn't have any money. She didn't get any phone calls. She didn't get any clothes. So she's walking the streets of Leningrad wearing this striped prisoner dress. And she came to her friend's house. Luckily, he was home, and he saw a ghost, right? Like, no one knows she's released. And so they called her father. They did give her a train ticket to Moscow because only in Moscow you can get an exit visa. And I think it's like a 7 or 8 hours ride on a train. And so the following day, she travels to Moscow, still wearing her prisoner dress. She met her father, and they bought her a dress, and then they went to get the exit visa. And so this is how she was released. My father and the pilot and some other people in the group, on the other hand, they were released because 2 Soviet spies were caught in New Jersey in 1979. And now the American government, not so different from the Israeli government, they don't have to keep it a secret. So it's all over the news. It's a big event. They come right into a rally, a huge rally in front of the UN. They were greeted in New York, and 2 or 3 days after, they were back in Israel.
I well remember that rally. That was the most absolutely incredible. Absolutely incredible. I remember your mother's smile from one end of the world to the other.
Yeah. And that also answers not one of the questions in the chat, what happened to the other participants of the Operation Wedding. About I was 17 years old in 1970. I was a freshman at the University of Leningrad, where my classmate Vladimir Putin was also a freshman, same class. So I didn't really know much about Operation Wedding at that time, except that a bunch of hooligans or criminals were arrested and trialed. But among the dissidents arrested unrelated to the Operation Wedding was Vladimir Bukovsky, whom I knew because he was a fellow neuroscientist, and I kept an eye on him. And he was exchanged in 1976 for Luis Carvalhan, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Chile, imprisoned under Pinochet regime. This generated rhyming quips like a hooligan for Carvalhan, обменяли хулигана на Luisa Carvalhana. What kind of hooligans did you guys have in the Soviet Union who can be singularly exchanged for the general secretary of a major Western Communist Party? That really was when I started going back and digging into Operation Wedding and the exchanges of those so-called criminals. That I started looking into that after 1976 with Bukovsky's exchange. Next question is for Glenn. Glenn, what are your views on the impact of the Operation Wedding, and specifically, can you speak on the change in that impact between the real-time Operation Wedding and now, the 21st century? What did we learn?
I think we learned that the power of public protest, the need to get governments involved, the need to get everybody, as many people as possible on our side. Remember, that was pretty black and white at that time. I mean, today we deal with shades of gray because of social media, because of different political points of view. But then it was, we went all out, everything. We pulled every string, everything possible. But the principle is the same. You know, if you itch, scratch. If you see a problem, try to deal with it. Okay, and there are all sorts of levels of possibility, from writing emails to going out and demonstrating in the street to lobbying and everything else. The point is, do not stand by.
Yeah, I would second that. The worst thing is to remain indifferent, silent, inert. Take a step, take a position, do something.
So I think it might be time for our final thoughts, or do you want to get
just going to get to the final thoughts, and I would, Glenn, I would take your statement now, which is amazingly relevant, as a final thought. Anat, what would be your final thoughts? Maybe a couple of minutes.
Well, I mean, there is so much to say basically, but I just, when I finished the film and I started showing it, I realized that it's not enough. It needs to be not just this story, but the whole story of the Soviet Jewry movement needs to be taught in schools. So that's why I created the educational program. And so I mean, it is used by the educational ministry in Israel. It's not mandatory, but it is like recommended on their site anyway. Then it is used, and I hope it's can be used because we have it. I have it in Hebrew and in English. So yeah, I'm just hoping that we can pass it on to the next generation. People can be inspired by it. I created it specifically thinking about my 16-year-old, 15-year-old self. I was bored. When people told me about the stories, I was bored. For me, it sounded boring. So when I created the film, when I created the educational program, I was thinking, this is not boring. This is fascinating. And we just need to learn how to tell the story, So I was creating it in a way that I think speaks to everyone, basically, and not just like academic,
Thank you. And that is absolutely right. And we need this kind of history, to know about it, to talk about, to learn from it. I just, on a personal note, again, Operation Wedding is a symbol of courage under Soviet oppression. I remember as a refusenik in my community in Leningrad, in all our celebrations, the first toast would be "За самолетчиков," to the airplane plotters. That is how much we valued the step they took. I think it enabled us to be free in the end, to really remain hopeful that we will leave the Soviet Union. And it is believed to mitigate that international pressure on behalf of the Soviet Jews. In 1975, the Soviet Union joined the Helsinki Accords and committed to respecting fundamental human rights and freedoms. Not that they actually respected it, but the public face they wanted to make was that they will. And also KGB had to correlate its actions with the new norms. Helsinki Accords provided a legal pathway to Jewish immigration. Operation Wedding is thus widely credited with accelerating Soviet Jewish immigration by the late 70s and again in the late 80s and beyond. As Anat told us and Glenn, prior to the early 1960s, only 10,000 Jews were allowed to leave Soviet Union. After the Leningrad trials, after Operation Wedding, and until the end of 1979, almost 400,000 Jews left the Soviet Union. And that probably likely in large measure due to the Operation Wedding publicity and the storm of public pressure from the West that it started. And then in 1979, in December, Russians invaded Afghanistan and the relations with the West collapsed. Incidentally, Putin joined the KGB in December of 1979. Jewish immigration stopped completely till the late 1980s with Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. But the thaw of the 1970s started with the Operation Wedding. Thank you, Anat, for making the film. Thank you for making it available all over the world. I hope it will be watched in schools, in Jewish education programs, in any human rights and civil rights programs. We can learn a lot from it. Thank you so much. And Olivia, back to you.
Good. Well, we've had a program about heroes. We're all about heroes. Well, Anat, your parents certainly are heroes, and you, in bringing their story to light, you've done something heroic too. Jana, just your life as a refusenik and the life you've built here is certainly heroic. Glenn, without your activism as a student, who knows if the history would have been different. You certainly are a hero among us today. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us. See you next time. Be well. Take care. Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.